Well, hey, everybody, welcome back to the Holy Podcast. My name's Chris Reed, and I am not the typical host of this podcast. Typically, Pastor Matthew hosts because he's the one teaching through the messages and really leading this series for us. But he is out this week, and so I get the opportunity to kind of walk us through the conversation about the message that we heard on Sunday. Today, I'm joined by Stacy and Mackie and Michael, and really excited to get into the conversation where we are talking about biblical finances. And just to do a really quick recap from this past week, I'm not going to recap the whole thing, so if you missed it, I really highly encourage you to go back and watch this message. I've heard Pastor Matthew teach on biblical finances a lot of different times, and this was probably the most comprehensive and like point by point time that I've ever heard him lay it out, and which I thought was super awesome. He gave us 5 different principles that the Bible speaks about when it comes to money, and he's told us that God commanded to give the first and the best portion. God commanded to give the tithe, which was 10% or a tenth of the whole, and then God commanded ongoing generosity. God used offerings to fund his ministry, and God's purpose for his commands are always about our hearts. And so our finances are always wrapped into our hearts. And so these are the 5 points that he laid out, and he laid them out and gave biblical evidence for where we find these principles at and whatnot. But then he also started by addressing the tension that I think we all feel when it comes to, or at least we've all wrestled through as we've kind of come to terms with whether or not this is something that is just an Old Testament principle or whether or not it's something that continues on for a Christian. Because you don't see a whole lot in the New Testament about the tithe specifically. You know what I mean? And so that leaves a lot of questions and a lot of tension in people's hearts as we wrestle with like what's applicable for us today. What do we still need to kind of to adhere to? And I love the way that he presented it. But before we get to exactly what he says, I kind of want to I want to get into some of the questions and some of the pushback that you guys have heard over your season of ministry and kind of how you've come to terms with and reconciled those things in your mind.
Yeah, sure.
Anybody can start. So.
Yeah, do you just want to like go through like different questions we've had about it or different critiques of it?
What are some things you've heard or people have asked you and ways that you kind of addressed it?
For me, the biggest one, we were actually just talking about this right before the podcast started about like Jesus coming to fulfill the law, not to abolish it, not to, but to fulfill it. And it makes some things obsolete in that regard, not necessarily obsolete in their value. Like when you read the Old Testament, when you read Leviticus, when you read Deuteronomy, these books that are heavy with like just legislation, and here's what, the way that God wants his people led and all these laws, they all have the same heart behind them. In my opinion, you guys can 100% give pushback, but they all come from this perspective seemingly of God wanting his people to have the best life possible. That's a big one where it's like, you know why I don't want you to do this? Because it's going to keep you safe. And then also to keep each other safe. So for you to have the best life possible and the people around you to be edified and have the best life possible. With Jesus, his salvation work on the cross made all of this, not all of it, a lot of this older legislation, these things to keep people safe, they were holding to it at the time with this like sharp legalism of like, I have to do these things because God said so. I have to do these things that God said so. Then Jesus comes on the scene and he's like, why? Or we were just talking about Paul. Why were you even doing that? Like, what's the heart of it? Like you say, I'm not going to eat this to make me holy. It's like what comes out is actually makes you holy. It's like people were still following these laws and like, really obsessive over these laws. And it's heart of legalism because they wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to be in right standing with God. And you have much of the New Testament's pointing back to why did those laws even exist? Like, here's why, what are the greatest, love the Lord God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself is what Jesus said, the greatest of all commandments. They all point to those 2 things. And if you're doing those things, so that's where tithe comes in. And that's where the questions I've gotten most is like, is this an old obsolete law where now with the fulfillment work of Jesus, we don't have to abide by that anymore?
Sure.
It's a tricky question. My usual pushback to that is like, well, I don't need to tithe because, we don't have to follow Old Testament law anymore. I have like 2 major pushbacks to it. One is that Jesus said so. When I don't know if I'd have to pull up specifically who asked, who posed the question, but it was either his followers, maybe it was Pharisees, asked him specifically about tithe, how they might not have to. And he said, no, you still should tithe. You should also do this stuff as well. That's the words of Jesus. He's saying, no, you should still tithe. The immediate pushback is always, yep, that's before he died and rose again, though. So in that culture, they still should have because he had yet to fulfill the law. My thought and pushback to that pushback, I'm having an imaginary argument right now, so like, stick with me. But my always response is, you can then, does everything that Jesus said post-resurrection not apply then? Because he was
pre-resurrection.
Sorry. If everything that he said pre-resurrection, well, he was only talking to that crowd who had yet to experience the fulfillment of Jesus saving us and like that like in that salvation work. That is the classic slippery slope of like, then you have to discredit everything he said just for a cultural moment. In my opinion, if Jesus said something, I'm going to find a lot of value in it and a lot of authority in it. And I'm always going to err on the side of, what did Jesus say? I'll go with that because I think it's safe. Could I go to heaven one day and he might say like, that was just for maybe, but like, no one explicitly said afterwards that was the case. Because Jesus himself confirmed that, I'm going to assume it applies to me as well. That's one part. The other part is, again, you look at the spirit of all these laws, they're fulfilled by that work of Jesus, only in that there are better ways to love your Lord God with all your heart, better ways to love your neighbors yourself. Giving less money to the kingdom of heaven doesn't accomplish either of those things. So if you're being intellectually honest, like, I don't have to tithe anymore because that law is obsolete. It's like, is it though? Because you have many of those Old Testament laws that, while the food that we consume might now be different, because we know that there's more safety in it. It's in what we consume. All that said, though, I've yet to hear a compelling argument why God would ever desire us to be less generous with the church, or why that would somehow love God better or love people better. Yeah. So Jesus talked about it. I'm going to take it seriously, but also paired with that, I don't know that like any death and resurrection on the cross, as powerful as that was, would make us not have to do that. Because to me, it feels like a continued extension of loving Lord God with all your heart, loving your neighbor as yourself.
Well, I think even to that, like I think about Sabbath, and I think about the idea of that in a very similar way that I think about tithing. Yeah. You have this principle that you see modeled from the beginning of creation, this idea of rhythm into our lives, this idea of we're not our work, this idea of like God has ultimate rest for us, this shalom, this peace, and he wants us to have it. And I'll hear a lot of people say like, man, Jesus fulfilled that. We don't have to do a Sabbath anymore. And my response is always like, I would like to have a day off. Yeah. I feel like that might be something good. You know what I mean? And so like Jesus does fulfill, he is our ultimate rest. And like you watch videos like the Bible Project and they'll talk into that, and they'll talk about Hebrews chapter 4, that how Christ is our ultimate rest and he does fulfill that. So does Sabbath keeping need to be a legalistic thing? Absolutely not. Is Sabbath keeping good for our lives? Is it beneficial and does it give us the best life? Absolutely. Right. Yeah. Tithing is the same way. And we're going to talk about it in greater detail why that is here as we kind of go. But like, it's the same thing. It's the same idea. God institutes this very practical, very efficient way of freeing our hearts from money and keeping us focused on him as our provider. And so why would it not be beneficial to do in our life?
There are also things in the Bible that even predate law in that sense, where like the Sabbath is one of them. That's what some people would call a creation ordinance. Like literally God in creation modeled a Sabbath, you know. The idea of giving your first and best portion, that predates law. Like there are things that like you look at, because it doesn't seem to be, where you have all these laws are basically all built around how to keep people in right standing with God. Then when you mess up, here's the sacrifice part of how to fix it. That's all these laws. Now the sacacrifice part doesn't have to happen. The real big question is, what is still edifying? What still helps me love God? What helps me love each other? I will never hear a compelling argument that a Sabbath doesn't help me or the way that I love people, help that even my relationship with the Lord, to know that he loves me enough to desire rest from my heart. Yeah. That's where I love the fact that we serve like an intellectually honest God. Like one, he's a God of logic, and that's where I have to weigh many of those things from. If there's something that like doesn't assist me in that, that's probably not like, I'm not going to worry about having a mixed blend cotton shirt, because although that's a Levitican law, it's like I'm not going to. That doesn't help me love anybody. It doesn't help me love God. It's like, but man, giving to the church certainly does. It's like, but man, taking a Sabbath certainly does, and that to me is where I think a lot of the power in this stuff comes from.
Sure. Yeah. What about you guys? What are some things that you've heard and you've had to kind of address and work through?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Mackie.
No, I agree with both what you guys said. Is there's rhythms that God designed from the very beginning. You know what I mean? That what's the point of asking? What's the bare minimum I can do? I think that's what that message, and I'm sure we'll get into that more. Sure. But that at the end of the day, if you're asking constantly the bare minimum of what you can do to follow God, I mean, at the end of the day, it's like, oh, I don't want to take a Sabbath because X, Y, and Z. It's like. That's fine, but it's also not the best life possible that you can be can be lived, because God designed it a certain way. But I've heard similar things, similar people pushing back and wanting to kind of unhitch their wagon, so to speak, from the Old Testament, where it commands to tithe, that talks about first fruits and all these things. It's a really good conversation to have, and I totally agree with you guys. Is God set up a life, and He designed rhythms and principles for our life that we ought to follow if we want to live an abundant life.
Yeah. Not necessarily the tension between the Old and New Testament, but just a lot of questions that I know that I've had to help people with is two of them. And I know we're going to kind of talk about it, so I'm not going to do too much talking about it right now. But the one is, but what if I give 10%, I just don't give it all just to the church?
Yeah.
And I thought Pastor
Oh, wow,
Matthew
yeah.
addressed that really well. And I know we're going to talk about it
Sure.
a little bit. But then the second one is, well, what about if I don't give financially, but what if I give of my time? What if
Okay.
I give of my talents? And to me, my answer to them is it's always both and. It's
Yeah.
always both. Like you're called to serve and you're called to give, So, and I think we're going to talk about all of that today, but those are probably the two most common questions that I get asked on a regular basis.
To get into some of the technical questions, like people have asked, like, well, isn't the tithe essentially a temple tax? Like, wasn't it something that like was just a tax for the Old Testament so that they could raise funds for the ministry? And absolutely, it is.
Mm-hmm.
It was that for people, and it was so that the Levites could live, and so that they would, because, and I believe Pastor Matthew shared this in the message, but the whole idea of the Levites' portion was God. And so the way that God decided to support them was that because they didn't get inheritance in the promised land, they were to be shared with, and they were to share in the rest of the tribe's inheritance. And so the tithe really, it fed, it clothed, it put a roof over these men that would be priests and their families. And so, and a lot of them, honestly, they were just part of the community 9/10 of the year. Every once in a while they would go and they would serve in the temple or serve in the tabernacle. And so they were being funded, their lives were being supported by these things. So yes, it was a tax, but, and now that the temple's not around, like, does that diminish that tax? No, you know what I mean? Because the principle's still there. And again, I think we're alluding to a lot of things that we're going to get into the details of later, but I think all of these questions kind of really stem from really like technicalities that we don't want to buy into. I think we feel that tension of Paul when he says, like, he says two things. First of all, he harps hard on not finding our salvation through the law. So I think we feel that tension there.
Yeah.
But then also he goes on and he says that we should give without reluctance, and we should not give under pressure. And so he introduces these two ideas, and these two ideas come from 2 Corinthians 9, chapter 7 through 8. And I'm just going to read it so that we can kind of talk about it here for a second. He says, "You must each decide in your own heart how much to give, and don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure. For God loves a person who gives cheerfully, and God will generously provide all you need. Then you will always have everything you need and plenty left over to share with others." All right. So that sounds like a contradictory idea. Now, we've all had this discussion before and talked about this. We know Paul's not contradicting
Right.
the idea of tithing here, but why not? So would one of you be willing to kind of bust out and explain that a little bit?
I mean, he's talking about the extra. So I feel like in this, he's already addressed maybe tithing. We just don't see it here.
Yeah.
But they knew the idea of tithing, and he's almost saying, like, this is your above and beyond. Like, this is everything extra. But I think even when you think about the idea of tithing, you can be cheerful about it. Like, that's what he's saying. Like, don't be reluctant about it. Don't just look at it from a legalistic standpoint. Be like, man, what an honor it is that God calls me to give 10% to his ministry, to what he wants to do. And then he also gives me all this leftover, possibly, that I could then be generous with other people, or I can be generous to other ministries or other things in that.
Yeah, Paul's planted this new church in Corinth, and he's teaching them a lot of things that would be basic to us as Christ followers, but they really aren't basic. And sometimes the most simple and basic things are the best things we need to hear. This is one of those, right?
Yeah.
Even when it comes to the tithe or giving above and beyond, it's important to not only know the command and know the principle, but know the heart behind the principle and the command.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Right.
I think
Right.
that's what Paul's really addressing. I don't think he's giving a prescription that's outside of the norm of what God's already designed, the principle he's already designed in tithing and giving. But he's saying honestly, he's kind of adding on to the weight you have of when you do that thing. So
Right.
you think about
that's
Jesus, every time he talks, like he talks about, hey, do not murder. In fact, if you hate another person, that's like murdering in your heart. He does this over and over again.
Yeah.
He takes old principles and he doesn't dumb them down or water them down. He actually adds a new layer to it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what Paul's doing here
Yeah.
is like, not only should you give and follow the commands God's given us, but give cheerfully,
Right.
which
Right.
if you thought giving was hard, imagine giving. That's how I read this.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's good.
Michael, you got thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I even think a literal reading of it feels to me still safe in the sense of you must decide in your heart how much to give. That's factually true. Like no one is going to come take your agency. No one's going to come
Right.
make you do anything.
True.
And he's also saying like, don't do it under pressure. Like this is a decision that you're going to do. And when you do it cheerfully. It's like, that's factually true. To me, it's not saying give less. It's saying like it's not just to give. It's not just to give because you're being pressured. It's not just I'm going to give a tithe because my pastor told me to give a tithe. No, this is a decision between you and God. And if you're gonna, when you do it, you're going to do it cheerfully. That to me does not mean you shouldn't tithe. It doesn't mean it's a call for less. It's saying,
Right.
but when you do it, I would put it in a similar space as communion. Like, yep, you cannot do it. It's like, but if you're going to do it, your heart should be right with the Lord.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with tithing.
Yeah.
It's like no one's going to make you
Right.
do something. Like if you're going to do this, you have to do it within your own character and integrity
Yeah.
with a cheerful heart.
Yeah.
Because that's what God wants from you. And It's
Right.
just like,
Right.
so I would say you're in equally dangerous territory is if you're tithing, but it's just like, but there's no thought behind it. There's no care behind it. There's no, or you're angry, or especially if you're angry or bitter about it. It's like, I don't know that that's holy either. Like what Paul's saying, again, it's exactly what you guys said. He's furthering this idea of tithing. He's not diminishing it. He's not saying, yeah, I can get away with 1%, but
Right.
as long as you do it cheerfully, it's not like that. It's a deeper of like, oh no, like you will do this with the right heart, or else we're not in right standing with God and what He'd have for us.
Right.
And to me, that's how I've always read that. And I can understand there are different translations. And I wanted to say this to you just because I'm not sure I quoted it right earlier. It's in Luke 11 and also Matthew 23. It's but woe to you Pharisees, for you tithe, mint, rue, and every herb, so over these things, and neglect justice and the love of God. Very similar to many times in the Bible. You guys are doing the right stuff, but you're not doing it with the right heart.
Yeah.
And this is what Jesus said, these you ought to have done. You should have tithed that. You should have done that stuff without neglecting the others. That's exactly what Paul's saying.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, do this stuff. This is important. This is what God has for you.
Right.
But if you're missing the heart of God, in this case, he's talking about justice, neglecting people. In Matthew, it says justice, mercy, and faithfulness. If you're neglecting these things, it's like, man, you're missing the heart of God. If you're doing it with a disgruntled heart, if you're doing it, then I wouldn't say we're in God's plan either. So it's a deeper relationship with tithing and understanding, not a lessening of it.
Yeah.
Well, isn't it so? When he's asking for this, when he's talking to them, like he's thinking about, because what his charge was at this time was to go and collect an offering for those that were famine stricken in Jerusalem. So he's coming, like you said, Stacy, taking an offering over even above what is their normal offering,
Yeah.
and he's doing it for the purpose of like inviting them into this place of like, hey, your brothers and sisters in Christ in Jerusalem, they're hurting right now.
Yeah.
They need your generosity. They need your love, your compassion. So as you think and pray about this, I know that you normally do all of these things. Seek God. Ask God what He would have you do above and beyond that, and then do that. And don't feel any pressure to be a part of that, but do that. But the whole idea of like God will provide for you as you take steps of generosity, as you bite into the compassion, as you do all of these things, God is the one who provides. And that is, I think that's the truth that gets us to the place to where you guys are talking about, that place of like the heart behind it should be joy. It should be, it should lack reluctance. Why? Because reality is people struggle with this and people have tension with this because it costs them something. It's hard. It's difficult. And Paul stands here and says, well, you should do it cheerfully because Christ or God will generously provide all you need. And I think that's really the premise that sets up the idea of tithing.
Yeah.
It sets up the idea of God's view with our money. And so I want to get into looking at some of the specific points that Matthew made throughout the message. And I want to keep that idea in mind because his final point was it's about the heart. It's about the heart. And so as we process through these very specific things, keeping that in mind of how do these things stir faithfulness in our hearts? How does it stir generosity in us? How does it stir cheerful giving and get us to the place where we're both in our actions and in our intentions and in how we think about this, come to the place where we trust God with everything.
Yeah.
So let's go to the first point. God commanded to give the first and the best portion. So Pastor Matthew talked about that a little bit, just in that, like, the very first thing that God asked Israel to do when he rescued them was to set aside their firstborn, how this was inconvenient, how it doesn't make sense, and explain a little bit why it doesn't make sense in this moment, or let me ask it this way. This idea of first and best portion always is a demonstration of faith. It is the best demonstration of faith that we can give when it comes to giving our money. Why is it the best demonstration of our faith in God? Why is giving the first important in taking a step of faith? Stacey, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, because oftentimes, like, on paper, it doesn't make sense. Pastor Matthew was talking about, as Americans, we live above what we make. Like, we do not stop short of it. We're living above and beyond our means and everything. And so oftentimes when you do look on paper, it's like, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to give this to God. I look at my giving statement at the end of every year and I'm like, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money that could go towards other things. But when I decide to give to God first, it really is faith. And I'll probably share a little bit of our testimony later, but it really is just taking that opportunity and saying, sometimes it is like, God, I don't know how this is going to work out. I don't know how all my bills are going to get paid, but I know you've called me to give to you first. And so I'm going to give. And it is faith. It is taking that step of faith and saying, it doesn't make sense, but I know God's going to take care of me. Yeah. And I know he's going to be able to provide exactly what I need.
Yeah. If you never take that step of faith, right, how is God going to prove to you what he can do, right? Like, anytime you're trying to build trust, whether it's in a relationship or even in your relationship with God, you have to stick your neck out there and you have to sacrifice something in order for God to prove to you that he is trustworthy, right? So, someone lies to you or someone breaks your trust. What do you have to do to mend that fence? What do you have to do to build that trust back? You're going to have to put your neck out there again. You're going to have to, go out of your way to say, hey, I'm going to give you a little more trust and see what happens. I think it's similar with God. And if we don't ever take that step of faith, then there's no opportunity for God to ever prove to us how good he really can be.
100%.
Yeah, it's super good. For me, I think that so few things are as visceral and tangible as your money. Like, I don't know that anything has such a quantifiable weight to it in my life that my finances do, to where if I don't have enough, I am in trouble. If I don't have enough sleep, I can make it work. If I don't have enough alone time, I'll be okay. I can make it work. You run out of money, like, things get really tough really fast. The idea, and even to think about, like, when the idea of your first and your best portion, you're talking about people who are in essence survivalists. Like, the moment that you have the fall of man, you are going to have to go work the land. You are out of the Garden of Eden. Talk about high stakes. If I don't pay my bills, I have wiggle room of, like, all right, I probably have X amount of time before they come foreclose my house. I have a lot of resources. I can go crash with family. You're talking about people where it's like your survival is contingent on what you produce. That is, as an American, I have immense privilege of even the poorest in our country are still generally covered and paid for, whether it be through nonprofits, whether it be through government assistance. Like, we're talking a pretty safe environment to give in. When this was authored, when these things became principle, it's like that was not a safe environment. Like, when there is no promise of more, there is no promise of greater, there is no, and that's just like the harsh reality of their life. That's the harsh reality of the fall of man. So what a wild, preposterous call to give your first and your best. And I think it's twofold. One, like, as you guys were saying, there's a element of, like, you're giving God that opportunity to show what he can do with less, which is a beautiful, powerful thing. Like, the assumption is that if I give 10%, it's that God's going to make up the deficit in that 10% because of his holiness and his goodness. And it's a very tangible way to put your faith in that. But there's also this conviction of, like, but, like, even if he doesn't, like, he's still worthy of that and more. Like, it doesn't matter. I don't want to give just to receive with God. And I think that's part of giving with a joyful heart. Like, it's not this, like, magical genie where if I tithe, that means he's going to do this. Dude, I've had financial problems. I've tithed my entire life. Like, but it's just a principle. Like my parents, when I was a kid, for chores, they would give me 10 dimes One went to the church, one went into a piggy bank, and I could spend the other 80 cents. Like that was like a very basic way that I learned early on.
Yeah.
Sure.
My whole life, I've heard how to say, save some money, give it to God, and then you can keep the rest, do whatever you want with, right? There's this, but in spite of that, so my whole life with this principle, I have still fallen on very difficult financial times, mostly of my own doing. You know, I love spending money. I love stuff, you know, I guess the reality.
We all do, I think, yeah.
You can tithe or not, you can still make very bad financial decisions, you know? But that being said, like, it doesn't matter if I got something from this. This is the principle of like, not only is God worthy of that dime of my 10%, he's worthy of everything.
Yeah.
Regardless of the blessing I get from
Right.
this. Like, I don't want to do that with an agenda. I don't want
Right.
to do it just to receive. I want to do it because God's worthy and he's holy of it. Luckily, God's awesome.
Yeah.
And he blesses our faithfulness. Like, what a
Right.
cool thing. But like, man,
Right.
that's not the, I don't want that to be the sole motivator. While I believe that also happens because I've also, while I've fallen on hard financial times, I've also had deep blessing financially. And I have to assume that's part of it
Right.
because God blesses us when we're faithful, but I don't want that to be the core motivator. He's worthy of the whole thing.
Right.
He's worthy. Like I don't.
Exactly.
None of us deserve to be here. Like, you know, what are the wages of sin? It's death. You know, the gift of God is eternal life. Like we're already on borrowed time in that sense, on the time that Jesus bought with his salvation work.
Right.
The thought of him not being worth that 10%, really the whole thing is like, man, I'm lucky to be here in the first place. So I don't want to. I'm not going to withhold that. But it's terrifying. You know,
I think too, though, you know, when you're saying that, like, it's not just God he could, and he doesn't always just financially bless us. You know, oftentimes it is just the blessing of like a changed heart, a changed motivation, a change, you know, a change in thought of how I actually am spending my money. And so, you know, even listening to Paul, it's like when you give cheerfully to God, he's going to bless you. It may not be a financial blessing, but man, it could be something else that's even better, you know, even better than that financial blessing that could come from it.
So good.
Well, I know in my life, like the areas of finances have been the tangible places where God has proven himself for me. And the blessing that I get from that is that in all of these other areas of my life, I have learned that God is faithful because he's been faithful here.
Yes.
So
exactly.
like, so speaking to what you were talking about, Stacey, like that idea of like, yeah, it may not be financial, but like for me, it's been like in this area of finances, it's been almost like the most tangible way that God has demonstrated to me that he can come through when it doesn't look like when it doesn't look like anything else will come through. It's those moments that I always think back to when I'm pressed against with another challenge, with the challenge of how am I going to get all this stuff done when I'm like, how is this all going to come together? What's going to happen with my kids? Like with that in mind, I go back and I go, oh, faith is a result of God proving himself in a lot of different ways. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So
definitely.
Okay. So Michael, you said you've tithed from the time that you were young. A lot of people, and I would say it's probably a simpler thing to do if you start from the beginning before you form your budget.
Sure, yeah.
I would say most people hearing this already have a budget established. They're learning how to do this new. What advice would you give in a practical way to get to this place of giving first and best? And is there a way to do it without removing the risk, or is risk always going to be involved with it?
Yeah, that's a super good question. So going back to even this idea of the first and best portion being authored to people who are in survival mode, right?
Sure.
There is always risk.
Yeah.
Like in that, and I don't know that the desire of his heart is to make us feel uncomfortable and to make us feel risky. You know, like I don't think that's it. I don't think that his function is like, I'm going to keep you in your place. I'm going to keep you on your heels. I'm going to keep you scared.
Right,
I want to take
right.
10%. I want to take your best in your first, so that way you're a little nervous. Like, no, that's not it.
We feel the risk.
But that being said, I think
yeah.
forever you'll feel the risk. You're right. There is a built-in comfort in the fact that I've based my budget on this my entire life. But that being said, like it's still, you talked about looking at your year-end giving statement where it's just like, or here's where I get it, is more an envy, where it's like, so even less risk and more envy. Where I look at people and be like, how do people have that much money to go on these trips and go do this? I'm like, oh, that's because 10% of their liquid income is still with them. It's like, they're like, if I had like 10%, because at this point my budget is formed with that 10% of flex, you know, or just gone.
Yeah.
If I said 10% of my income that I could spend on whatever I want without consequence, because everything else is already covered, that's how you do, you know, all that. So that's where it hits me. less of risk and more envy and more like, oh man, like I'd love to go do that. And I love, and that's where I get that, where I need to check my heart and go back to that. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it with a happy heart, or else I'm not even going to do it at all, because it's just as sinful at that point. Like I want this to be because I enjoy and I trust that God's going to provide in these moments. And I trust that this 90% is going to go way farther than my 100% because I have the anointing of God on it at that point. I think that's really meaningful. Yeah.
What about you guys?
I think sometimes, I think there is risk involved. You know what I mean? Like, and maybe you're like really good financially and you're just like, oh, this is just the missing piece. And that's awesome. You know, like that's incredible. But I think, anytime God commands us to do something, I think there's always a level of uncomfort with it. And I also think that there is always a level of risk from our perspective,
Sure.
not from his perspective, but I can look at that. Like I said, it doesn't make sense on paper. But at the same time, I think you can then, it almost causes you to reprioritize everything else. Like, oh, I spent that amount on clothes this last month. Now I can not spend that on clothes and I can give it to God. You know what I mean? So I think it helps to kind of reevaluate where you are spending, but there may be a little bit of a risk, and I think it is like doing it wisely. I think with everything, we always ask God for wisdom, doing it from a wise posture. Like, obviously, if you have nothing to your name, then we need to have a conversation. We have financial mentors to help you with that. But I think, I just think that it's worth doing it. There may be a risk involved, but do it wisely.
Yeah. I think there's always risk. I think it depends on what you're risking, right? So like Michael was explaining, that risk to some people is very real. Like I can't make my rent payment this month or next month. You know what I mean? That like survival is based on what I produce. So that's a risk for some. Early on in ministry, I learned this pretty quickly. It's still a kind of a mystery that I've worked through, prayed through, and honestly, even having conversations like these are good for it. But I learned early on in ministry, a lot of the people who push back against the idea of generosity in general or tithing are the people that are just risking some level of comfort and they're not risking any kind of survival type thing. Let me be even clearer about that. Like the people that often push back against generosity are the people that have very much the means to be generous. I've noticed that over and over again. And I'd say there's a risk for them too, but I think they're risking comfort at that point. You know what I mean?
100%.
And I think when Paul talks to people about being a cheerful giver, I think anytime God commands it, I think anytime Jesus talks about it, I think a lot of times he is talking to the people that's like, hey, you're well within your means to, but there is something going on in your heart that is holding you back from following that principle or being obedient in that. So I would say there definitely is risk involved. And, in the former conversation I talked about where it really is a practical thing of if I were to give 10% of my income, it would really put you in this spot. I think that is worthy of a conversation at a table, with a pastor, with people, with where a lot of churches don't have financial mentors. And our church is blessed enough to have people like that, but to have a conversation at the table of what that looks like, because in that situation, I think God looks at the heart before he looks at the legalistic side of, checking off that box, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you guys all have spoken to it so really well. I don't really have a whole lot to add to the thought of this, but it really does stem back to, I think what we're going to have to come to if we have a budget already set and we're like in that place where we're strapped, we're at 100% or 105% of our income. It is going to be a value question at that point. Like, do I value this more than I value something else? And so you can't operate off of more than what you make. You know what I mean? And so like that's a reality of life. But at the same time, what I've seen happen and what people I think are afraid to step into because there's no certainty of it is that space where if I live by my values here, what happens if it doesn't come through? Yeah. What happens if it doesn't pan out? And this is, as a pastor, this is the conversation that I have with people regularly. They're like, I'm not going to make my bills this month. I decided to not give my tithe because I needed to pay my bills. And there is there's this sense and this feeling inside that where it's like, as a pastor, me giving advice in that moment is like, I have to check my heart and I have to go back to the experiences that I've had where I go, I said, I know this doesn't make sense. I know that it makes more sense to take care of your bills first. And then if you have money left over to give, but what I've found in my experience and what God promises is that if I give that first, even with that void will be taken care of by God. And so like that is the advice for somebody that's got a full budget. Like you have to shift your values. You have to be willing to say, this is my priority. And then you get to see, it's like you guys have already said, like you get to see where God steps in and provides those things. There have been a lot of seasons. I'm the same way as you, Pastor Michael. I've tithed for as long as I can remember, or at least had some form of generosity where it was purpose generosity. It was more than what I wanted to do often at times. But there still have been seasons in my life where finances have been tight, where we've made financial decisions, not even that were bad necessarily, but we sacrificed for the sake of Cassie staying home with the kids, or like where you make these different financial decisions and there's risk to it because you're not quite sure that your bills are going to be paid. But we've always been able to tithe. We've always been able to be generous, or we've always made that a purpose thing. And then what I've watched in my life is time after time after time where I have been up against a desperate need that I was like, well, if you don't show up, this is not going to work. God shows up.
Yeah.
And you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I just have to think like, I mean, Mackie said it really well. Like you have this tension of like, if there are things in your budget, if you have conveniences, like this is a very easy conversation to me.
Right.
It's like,
Right.
So last year I had a Jeep that I had like, I think like a $390 monthly payment on my Jeep. And first of all, terrible investment, broke down all the time. Like, as you guys can all attest, the amount of times I'm like bumming rides to work.
I'm pretty sure you tried to get me to buy one.
I was a terrible financial. Like, everyone should get a Jeep. I love Jeeps. Never worked. I'm like, yeah. But so I had this Jeep, but I realized at the beginning of this year, like if I want to be able to afford more generosity, I have to get rid of things in my life, and that's just one of them. So I bought like a really junk car that I still drive for like $1,000, and that way I was out of that monthly payment, so I can bless people more. If that's where you're at, where you have anything you can cut to make a tithe possible, unapologetically, I'm like, oh yeah, every convenience, every streaming service, like that. That's how convicted I am. I do understand that I'm literally at 105%. I don't make enough money at my job to cover baseline food, electricity, power, rent. Like, okay, different conversation. That is where it gets complicated as a pastor to look at somebody and say, do it anyways. That's that word hits you in the gut like, oh, do I tell this person right now that I have to do it anyways? But here's where I have to keep coming back to. This stuff was authored at a time where they were talking about survival. They weren't talking about, even as dramatic as what I just said, power being turned off, not making rent, terrifying. They were talking about survival. Yeah. Like, I don't have food now. I don't eat. And if it was true then, it is true now. And I do believe that God shows up. Like I as a pastor, like I would rather, keep tithing. And then from church benevolence, well, let's help pay bills. Let's figure it out. That's a practical way. I've also seen God supernaturally show up and bless people when they do that.
Yeah.
I just have to believe. We've talked about this many times. If it's not true in the extreme, it's not true in the small situations.
Right.
If it was true then in the most extreme version of what we're talking about, I cannot on good authority tell anybody, no, this isn't true now. Right. You should probably play it safe.
Right.
You know what I mean? I can't get past that. Even if that advice feels at times cruel to look at somebody who's poverty stricken and struggling to make bills to say you should give 10% of what you have. That's a gut wrenching thing. But there's at one point, does my faith in God, does my belief in His Word and what He says, is that greater than my fear? And the answer is yes, and I have to do it every time because the consequences are greater than whatever I might fall upon myself. Yeah.
Have you guys ever seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade?
No.
Really? Oh man,
I've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I've only seen the first one. I haven't seen the other ones.
Okay, so the whole premise is like there's all these different tests. So he's looking for the Holy Grail, which was supposed to be the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper. So he's in all these. It's Indiana Jones. It's a story. So he goes through all these tests. It's all these like puzzle like maze type things where like darts are shooting out at him and it's dangerous and whatnot. But he gets to this one place where it's called the Bridge of Faith. And the way they shoot it, like you can't see that there's any bridge. It's just this big gap. And the clue is like the person who takes the step of faith is the one who will succeed. And so like the whole point being like you have to just step out over this ledge and you have to trust that that's what like that you're going to be supported. You're not just going to fall to your death. Like, and so like, it's really dramatic. It's way better than what I'm describing here. So if you haven't watched it yet,
that sounds, even the way you're describing it sounds pretty dramatic.
go and watch it. But that's the picture I get in my head.
Well, though, yeah.
I get that picture in my head every single time that I think about these moments where God brings us up to where what he's calling us to is a step off of a cliff.
Yeah.
And if we take it and he doesn't come through, we're done. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But if we take it and Indiana Jones, I'm going to ruin the movie for you. Indiana Jones takes that step and he takes this most dramatic step that you can take. He just like sticks his leg out straight and leans over and the bridge catches him. But that's the concept. Like, and that's what, from personal testimony, that's what I found to be true every single time. And sometimes it doesn't look exactly how I think. You know what I mean? I think it goes back to even the tagline of this whole series. We want the best life to be the easy life. That's not what it means.
No.
But you know what I mean? But
but how's the Bible not riddled with that imagery? Look at Abraham and his son.
Yeah.
Like, I want you to sacrifice your only son that was,
Right.
it's like, you want to talk about a gut-wrenching story of someone with kids now. It's like, dude, what? I don't know that I had that kind of faith.
Right.
Who is rewarded in the Bible?
People that take that
the
step.
people who take that step.
Right.
Into the crazy, into
Exactly.
the unknown, into the terrifying, into the complicated.
Yeah.
And it's like, man, I would rather, this is going to sound very dramatic, so I'm going to one up your Indiana Jones dramatic story. I would rather take that step and fail and run out of money and be poverty stricken and than not be obedient at that point. It's
Yeah.
like, man, at least at that point I followed my conviction, as scary as it is. And I've
Right.
never met somebody near the end of their life who said, I wish that I would have been more conservative. Like I wish I would have done the less of what God called for me, even when it was
Yeah.
risky. It's
Right.
99.9, if not 100% of the time, the alternative.
Yeah.
Of I want to do what God called me to do. If I could just have, and that's just it. That's where I said earlier, finances are like one of the only very real visceral things in that sense of like, dude, this is my survival. This is my electricity. This is my, So how much do I believe in what God called me to do? Like, do I really? And it's just like nothing else is that tangible in my life. And that's where unapologetically, like I just have to, I'm just going to keep doing it. And since then, luckily, I said we serve this magnanimous God who loves us and cares for us, who provides in that, so that's the beautiful part of it. But again, even more than the reward part, like I want to be obedient.
Yeah.
Like, more than any risk, more than any fear, I'd rather be obedient.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna combine the next two kind of topics. He talked about God commanding a tithe and God commanding ongoing generosity. And the tithe, as Matthew explained it, is 10% of the income. It's something that we see modeled as early as Abraham. We see Abraham giving a tenth to the priest Melchizedek, which that should be a topic of conversation someday. That's a pretty interesting topic. But so he gives this 10%, and then we see this pattern modeled time and time again. You get to the laws, and you start to hear some of these ideas of tithe being expressed as far as like temple tax, and then you start to see the temple tax actually starts to look more like 15, 20%, though the tithe is still the baseline model of what's happening with the temple. So Matthew said it on Sunday, and in the first service, he kind of briefly breezed past it. And he was talking about the idea of why the 10% is important, but then also the idea of ongoing generosity or generosity above and beyond. He said that the tithe is the base amount. It's the starting place.
Yeah.
And so if 10% is the starting place, what does God really want from our finances and how we operate in our finances?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in that obedience, really that principle he's teaching is that tithe is obedience. If generosity isn't just the obedience, it's something further than that obedience, right? So if that's the foundation, I think God is really looking at the heart at that point. So what is that heart beyond that obedience? It's generosity.
Yeah.
That's what God's looking for. You know what I mean? So I think that looks different in different seasons. You know what I mean? I think it probably looked different from the temple versus, further in history, but I think God's looking for generosity. I think he's ultimately looking for heart change. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Yeah.
Again, going back to the topic of there's just two different kinds of people that you can have a conversation about this with, and generosity looks radically different. So I don't think even past that obedience step, you can put, a number to it or like a to-do list. But generosity does look different for people, but I think it's the heart behind that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say. It is our relationship with him, and it is our heart. I shared this with our Connect group last night, but I was saying, if you really think about it, okay, look at the whole 100%. God only asks for 10%. 100% of it belongs to him, but all he asks us to give is 10% of it. And I think, and I've seen this in my own life, is that when I then give that 10%, it is a heart check for me to going where I say, man, look at what God has done with that 10%. You know, like we have 350 kids coming to the Tree.Church. You know, I'm able to be on staff here. We're able to welcome hundreds of guests every single year. And knowing that that's what that 10% is going to, it has almost shifted my heart to be like, I can go to the store and not buy anything because that's not worth it as much to me as what God could do with that other 90%. So does he want me to enjoy it? Yeah, absolutely. You know, we've gotten to do fun things with it because of the heart check that God's given to us. But at the same time, then it's like, okay, I've given my 10%. Oh, somebody's in need. And we were sharing this in Connect Group last night. We were like, it really is more blessed to give to other people than it is to receive. You know, like that joy that comes when you are like, God, I've given you the 10%, but the other 90%, I want you to be able to do with it what you want, because I know you're going to do way more with my finances, with my resources than I could ever do.
Yeah. You know, I think that there's, even as Stacey was saying that, I had to fight this like impulse in my heart of just like, oh, enough is enough. You already have 10. You know what I mean? It's just like, come on, man. Like, like I want to go do this thing. Here's the reality though. I've seen a shift in my lifetime. So I'm 30 years old. Haven't been here super long, but long enough to have seen culture change and move over that short period of time to where what I just said, enough is enough, right? That is a cultural piece of information that makes me think that that's too dramatic. And in different times in the Bible, different time study, even American history, that's not the case. So Acts chapter 4 says all believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions were their own, but they shared everything they had. And then that continues to say like what the function of that was, so they can continue to preach and testify the Lord Jesus, right? I have this illusion that like 10%, enough is enough. Like, oh, what are you talking about? It's like in this cultural context of the mission of like, we know that we need to further like the word in the work of Jesus' salvation. This is important. People came and gave everything that they had to this cause. And I have this illusion that 10% is enough. Like enough is enough, you know? I'm not necessarily saying like you should give everything to church. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying culture informs what feels dramatic. That's why it feels huge to me.
Yeah,
that's really good.
You've heard me gripe about this for years now. Stacey's usually a good person to gripe to because she's deeply empathetic and like, well, what about this person? She's like, you know, she always like makes me like centers kind of like. But I've had this complaint. I'm just gonna be really candid. So like, please forget if you want to talk more about this. Come, you know, you can come. If you're frustrated about it, I totally get it. But I've always had this similar frustration with people in their service to the church. To where I'll have throughout the years, I'll have a volunteer who's serving on the worship team once a month. They're like, hey, I need to take a break. I'm just feeling burnt out. My first pass is always, I'd be willing to bet the one time a month that you're serving your church is not the thing burning you out.
Absolutely.
Mostly because of your cultural information. It feels like things are too busy, so I need to cut back, and that's something to cut back on. Where it's like, even in my lifetime, again, I'm 30 years old, I've seen enough cultural change. When I grew up, a standard for going to church was multiple times a week. I went, and many people that I know, so not just my family, like a standard, at least in my church denomination, was we're going to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, and then Wednesday night for any kind of like youth ministry, small group time, you know, Bible class, whatever you're taking.
Right.
Now we've seen what's the latest Barnum study, you guys probably know it, where it's like, I think the average church attender that would call themselves committed goes like once every 3 weeks. I think that's the new.
Maybe even less.
It used to be like twice a month, and now it's like once every 3 weeks is like on average throughout the year. I look at that and I'm like, oh, like culturally, that's now the normal for a committed person. When I was a kid, it would have been like 3 times a week for like, oh, I'm like super committed to my church. Like I'm really committed to church. That is a pretty significant shift. And it's the same thing, whether your time, your money, it's like our cultural standards are informing what we view as too much or too little, where the reality is like, again, my time, my money, my resources, it is God's. It is all His.
Exactly.
How much of it goes to generosity to not? Every time I feel that ping in my heart of like, oh, that's already so much. I don't know. I don't want to. It's like, oh my gosh, like that's. I only feel that way because of my lifestyle, because of because of the way that I live, because of the way that the standard of success in America is. You want certain things, and I understand that economies change. Like buying a house right now is nearly impossible if you're like a starter home is gone.
Sure.
I'm not being naive to that. I understand.
Right.
But I also understand deeply when you read stuff like this, it's like, oof, like that I only feel that way though because of the standard that I live in today.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
The real standard that God has is literally everything you have is mine, and He is so loving and generous and holy and perfect and righteous that He blesses us throughout that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
every time I feel that thing of like, that's too much time, that's too much generosity, that means I have to sacrifice this. I always want to combat that with like, why do I feel that way, and how can I combat it with holiness and with giving with a cheerful heart, and with saying like, oh man, if I'm saying that's too much, what if I actually said not enough? What if I was like, how can I be more generous? How can I be
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
As you guys were talking, I think about the story of the rich young ruler. Like this is the story where Jesus comes to, or this young man comes to Jesus and he says, "Hey," he says, "How do I inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says to him, "Obey all the commands that God has put out." And he goes, "Okay, I've got obedience down," kind of like what you said. He's like, "I've got that. I'm doing that." And then Jesus goes, "Well, give everything that you own, sell your stuff to the poor, and then come follow me." And the guy goes away sad. And you can talk to 12 different Bible scholars and you'll get 12 different answers as to whether the guy comes back or what is the question that we always ask though when it comes to that story is Jesus saying that I have to give everything to follow him? Do I have to give away all my possessions to follow him? And I think the answer is yes and no. And so is God asking you to give every single dime that you have all the time? No. Like that's not a strict command that Jesus was giving.
Sure,
it would say he's telling a story to illustrate a principle, you know what I mean? And he's illustrating a principle. But the reality is that the heart behind that, the thing that sits behind the question that Jesus offers to the young man, and the thing that the young man needs to wrestle with is, am I willing to give everything and anything that I have to know Jesus and to follow him and to be with him?
Yeah.
And that I think is the question that comes down to with our finances, is just kind of what you said. That story encapsulates of if I would walk away sad and not be willing to say yes in a moment like that. If Jesus asked me to, like, I got to go back and I got to do some heart work. A lot of scholars will say, guy came back later and followed Jesus. I hope that that's true.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because what that does is that leaves room for the fact that I think all of us would go, oh man, you know what I mean? Like, and be bummed by that.
Yeah.
But then the hope that we can come to a place where we hold everything that we own with open hands because
Exactly.
God owns
so
it.
good, Pastor
Right.
Chris.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, so that we can respond this way. So the tithe does set the foundation. Obedience sets the foundation, like you said, Mackie. But the standard is everything. The standard is generosity.
Yeah.
And if we're not willing to go to that length, I think we have some heart work to do. And I think we've got some more relationship building, like what you said earlier, some trust building to do with God.
Right.
And that's not a bad thing to wrestle through.
Yeah. Right.
Because I think we would be dishonest if we said we don't all hit that moment in some place in our life where we go, I don't know that I'm ready to give that.
Yeah.
I think it has to start with the heart too, like you said. And what Michael was kind of getting to, what he was saying about, having this in your heart to be generous, that it has to come from your priorities and that you have to believe this thing, but it has to start with the heart. I think how hard would it be to do those things without a heart change?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like how hard would
Impossible.
those? It'd have to be impossible. You could probably fake it for a while, but like if your heart's just not in it, you're not gonna uphold that. You know what I mean?
There's
Like
a good story about Ananias about that too.
Yeah,
Like you want the
yeah.
appearance of like I'm in this, but the moment that there's a call for something greater, his story was kind of a bummer. You know?
and that's probably a really good way to look at that story too, because it's a dramatic story in Acts where like two people fall dead like at the doorstep. You know what I mean? I talked to a student multiple times about this topic, but one time I just got really real with the student because I knew him well, and he said, "Man, we're talking about doing devotionals, which to a lot of us is like, oh, that's easy, it's simple, or it's a normal practice of our life, to new Christians, and especially like, younger Christians, that can be like the hardest thing ever to do."
Yeah, sure.
And I was talking to him and I was like, so what do you think are some of the problems with doing devotionals? And he said, well, one is I don't know where to look. And I was like, okay, well, let's find you, places to look on creative ways to do it. He's like, also, I just don't have time. I was like, okay, real quick, pull up your screen time on your phone.
Right.
And he did. And I was like, it averaged like 5 hours a day. I was like, out of these 5 hours on, WhatsApp and, Neopets or whatever. That's a dated reference. MySpace, no, it's a terrible
I don't even know what that is, but I knew it was a cut. I was like,
I know what it is.
No, but like Instagram, whatever it may be, of those 5 hours, could you take 20 to 30 minutes to devote it to God? You know what I mean? But if his heart and his priorities didn't shift to think, oh, actually God does belong in that portion of my time. Same with the giving, right? It's like if your heart doesn't shift to realize, oh, God, that does belong to God, this portion, whatever it may be, I don't think it's ever going to happen.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of brings us to this place where you guys are all talking about very tangible expressions of faith. So we've talked about Sabbath as far as like rest. We talk about tithing. We've talked about with our money. We've talked about serving. Why is it important that the values that we express, so the value of I want to follow God, I want to love God, why is it important that those things show up in these tangible ways?
I mean, that's the obedience of it, like I can share, I've shared this a couple times on this podcast, but it's a little bit different than giving. But earlier last year, I felt like God was like, I want you to teach. And I was like, absolutely not. And, but like, it was a faith step. It was a step of obedience.
Sure.
And so even things like this, like that, I think God gives us tangible things to do because we are human, and he knows when I do this tangible thing and then I see what God does with my obedience and the way that he blesses it, it causes me to want to continue to do those tangible things. And it causes me then to want to take it to the next level.
Yeah,
so you think with like tithing, it's like, I remember that first time that we gave, and it was like, okay, we saw how God blessed it. We saw how we started to get our finances in order, and it's super tangible to us. So now we're looking at it and we're going, how can I go above and beyond now? You know what I mean? And so it's like with each tangible step, he calls us to a deeper tangible step because he knows we're human, because he knows that really is how we're going to almost kind of combine with God and really be able to see, I took this step, here's what God did. I took this step, here's what God did.
Wow.
Yeah, super good. Yeah, I mean, for me, it just feels like talk is cheap on some level. It's like there's a level of lip service that's possible within faith to say, I think this, I believe this. And you can say that all day long. Like I think about my relationship with my wife, and if I say, I love you, like I love you a lot. But if I know that she could use help, with our kids, and I'm just like, oh, I would rather go lay down. I'm going to go take a nap. It's like, oof. Or vice versa. If she says, Michael, I love you. And I'm like, these kids are, I got 3 toddlers. They're driving me crazy. And she's like, yeah, sounds good. I have to go take a nap. It's like, oh, maybe now's not the time. You know what I mean? It's like, if one, 100%, where there's a level of when you do something tangible, that's a tangible representation of where your heart is and what's going on the inside. Again, talking about marriage, if Gina were to be like, man, I'd really like to get, if it's her birthday, she's like, I really wish you would have got me flowers on my birthday. And if I were to in front of her, open up an app, be like, done, I just ordered you flowers. It's like, this is all lip service. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like there's something powerful about showing through action and through tangible volume things of like, this is, it's where your treasures, where your heart will be.
That's right.
How I'm spending my time, my money, my resources, am I sacrificing time? These are all things I can do in my marriage to show my wife like, hey, I would rather go chill out and go watch a movie right now. But instead, I want to do this to serve you that I know is going to bless you and make your life. If you look at any relationship and say that somebody just only verbally expresses how they feel with no action to back it up, it's a safe bet to say that they probably don't actually feel or experience the things that they're saying.
That's so true.
And as the reciprocant of that, your spouse might be like, oh, you don't love me. Like you say that and you even say it in the best, most flowery language. I heard a pastor once, it's like a really good illustration. It's like, if I go to my kids, I'm like, hey, go clean your room. And you go in there an hour later and they're like, hey, here's the deal, Dad. I read all about it. I looked up what it means to clean your room. Like I researched it. I think it's Francis Cheney said this. Like I researched it. I even learned it in the Hebrew and the Greek. I studied what it would look like to clean my room. I know all about it. It's just like, yeah, but like, did you clean your room? like no, but like I'm a master. I can go teach a course on how to clean rooms. It's like, okay, cool. And that to me is that relationship with God where it's like, cool. Like, you said it, like, all about it. You could even be preaching it. You could be a professor at college teaching this stuff. Did you go clean your room? Did you do what I asked you to do?
Yeah.
Did you actually do the things that you're called to do? We're not called to talk about stuff. And there's crossover there. Sometimes what we're called to do is to go talk about things. But man, if there's not tangible weight behind what you're saying, it's like, it's just, you're just talking. And like I said, talk is cheap. You have to have those tangible things that point to God and say, this is why I'm faithful, because I acted faithful.
Yeah. That's good.
Building on that analogy too, imagine like you woke up and like asked your wife, is like, do you think I have to hug you today? It's like, okay, how many times do I need to hug you?
Yeah.
It's like, do I need to say I love you? How many times do I need to say I love you? You know what I mean? Like, just
do I need to spend 10% of my day telling you I love you to make you feel loved?
Exactly. Like finding like, what's the bare minimum here? It's like eventually like that. There's no love in that relationship.
Well,
you know what I mean?
even draw that next to what Paul said, doing with a cheerful heart. Like, okay, I said I love you to my wife 10 times today because that's what she said is the minimum. Like,
check.
Yeah, nailed it. It's like, yeah, but like, do you love your wife? Yeah. Like, did you enjoy? Like, did you? And that's I think it's
yeah.
All right, I'm gonna go here, and I think people are gonna be like, "Man, you guys are jumping on this pretty hard." Imagine 10% of your sins are forgiven. You know what I mean? Like, so like that's or you know what I mean? Like, I'm only gonna forgive some of what, or do I have to? Jesus didn't take this hard or this posture at all. Wow. And so like when God went to express His love, what did He do? He became a tangible human being.
Wow.
He came to our level. He interacted with us in a way that we would understand, the way that we would experience. And then He took care of our problems in a way that we would understand, in a way that we would, you know what I mean? Like He did it all within the context of the Jewish faith at this time. And so it's like, what did He do? But he painted a picture for them of His love over and over and over again to the most extreme way that He could think to do it. And He did it in a way that they would understand the depth of His love for His people. And so like, as we are called to emulate Christ, like we have to realize like it's what you said. I'm not going to repeat. You said it so well, Pastor Michael.
No, you got it.
Like, but there's just this idea, like it has to have some flesh and bones to it. Like it's got to have some, it's got to have some meat to it, or it is. We can say anything we want, but yeah. All right. So, to kind of wrap this all up, what I want to do is I just love to hear from you guys, like all of these principles that we looked at. And I know we didn't touch on everything in this podcast, but like I said, go back and listen to Pastor Matthew's message if you want to hear the rest of them. But as you guys have lived out these principles in your lives, and as you've wrestled with them, and as you have found life out of them, the question that Pastor Matthew posed of does these things still bring value and supernatural blessing to your life? What are the stories that you could tell people from your own experience that absolutely this is something that is beneficial and a blessing to my life?
Yeah, for me, just a really like quick, easy. I can give you quite a few, but a very easy example for me is when me and Gina were looking for our house. So we had a small house that we bought in Lancaster, and then we just had too many kids. Like, so it's 2020. Yeah. So I mentioned I've got 3 toddlers. Their ages are 2, 3, and 4. So we had kids really quick, pretty crazy. And some would say irresponsible, but we made it work. But all of a sudden we found out Gina was pregnant with Myra, and we realized really quickly, like, we don't have space. Like we don't have room for all these kids. And we just had like a 2-bedroom house. And we're just like, oh man, what are we going to do? We were trying to get really creative, and the way the house was laid out, it would have been like very challenging. And so we just prayed, and we're like, all right, it's the middle of COVID, but we're going to try to sell our house and buy a new house. And the housing market, it's even crazier now, was just really wild. And we probably made 7 offers on houses that were really, good offers, things that like in theory should have been taken just to get a house that had 3 bedrooms. We're not looking at 4-bedroom. We're like, they can still share. We just need more space at this point, or else we don't, So we're hunting around and can't find anything. We can't find anything. Making all these offers, nothing is taken. And I was almost frustrated because we felt like we made a prayerful decision, and it felt like God did not hold up His end of the bargain. It was like, dude, all right, like you got to help out at some point. Like we felt like we had like a green light to do this. What's going on? Like we already had an offer to land on our house. We're getting ready to close on it. We don't have anywhere to go. We're like, what do we do? And just this guy whose house was off the market, our realtor found him, and he sold us our house in for the exact same price that we were selling our house for. That had where we had a backyard that probably was like 600 square feet. It was so small, to a house that had 1/4 of an acre as a backyard, and a house that had 2 bedrooms, to a house that had 3 bedrooms and like a finished basement, and like all these spaces that we can kind of build out and really raise the family that we knew by volume we had at that point. for the same exact price point, way under, like supernaturally way under the market. Like when we bought it, it was instantly like $60,000 in equity because we bought it under the market. It's like, whoa, this house was valued way more at that point. And it was just crazy. It was like, man, like we had this burden from God to go try to do this thing, and it got really concerning. And we thought this was an act of faithfulness, and that's where the doubts come in. Of like, dude, let's get real, God. I've tithed my whole life. This is your fault. it's like I've been faithful. Like you hear all the cool stories. Like, well, come on, like clutch you up.
Yeah.
And God was just so extravagant, that generosity. It's a house that I love to this day. I'll probably die in that house. It's like it's a beautiful home, and it's got a really great time at a super low interest rate. And it's like, man, for that even to where we did not intentionally have kids in that timeline. We didn't intentionally think that we're gonna have to outgrow this house to be like, all right, God, like let's see if you provide, for him to do so with such generosity.
Yeah.
So I'm not a prosperity gospel driven person to think if you tithe, good stuff happens.
Right.
But I do believe that was how do you call that anything but supernatural in my life? Of like God showed up and provided a really beautiful home for us to move into and to raise our family into. And it's I'm not saying it's exactly because I tithe this amount, because I was generous this amount, but it is just a reminder of the fact that God is super faithful. And if he calls you into something, he's gonna open up the doors for you to be able to, accomplish what you need to. And that's just how generous he is with us.
Yeah.
I'd love to share just kind of our journey with it. So I grew up in church. I did not start tithing until I was on staff at the Tree. Just because I didn't understand it. I didn't feel like it was taught well. I didn't understand the heart behind it. And so then coming on staff, it is a requirement, but we do it joyfully, it's part of core membership. And I remember that first time that we gave it was tight. Like, and I can still remember, we decided through that we were tithing, and we were like, man, we both came into our marriage with a lot of debt. We both came in with a lot of poor decision making, in the past. And I hope that our story can encourage somebody. But we were like, no, we need to do this. This is what God's calling us to do. And so we tithed once, and we were like, okay, we survived. Like we may only have $50 to our name, but we survived. Yeah. We did it again and again. And I will say, we do have one of those stories where then God was like, here, let me show you what I can do with your obedience, whether it be raises or we sold stuff, But in that same time frame, we were looking at our finances, and we were like, we do not honor God with what we're spending. We've got all this credit card debt. We need to get that taken care of, and we need to be more focused on what we're doing. And so we really got really into like budgeting and making sure. And this is like the tangible thing for people is that I get it. I understand. It doesn't look right on paper. When I said that, that's because I lived that out, where we were like, this doesn't make sense. So we start tithing. We start paying off debt. And now we're at a place where we were even talking the other day where it's like, it is easy to go in and out of a store and only grab the milk that you need, or only grab the things that you need, because we're like, man, God has been so incredibly generous to us. We put in the hard work. We didn't eat out for 6 months. We didn't buy extra stuff. It was literally like, what is our budget? We are sticking to that. And now we are at a place where it's like, man, I love to give that 10% because I know what God's doing in the ministry. Wow. But I also I can be at the grocery store and see a mom who's struggling and be like, I'm gonna pay for your groceries today. I'm at a place where it's like, we can take friends of Cadence's on vacations with us, things like that, where it's like, it really is so much more life-giving to be able to do these things, where we had a story in our past where it was like, we weren't giving to God. We weren't walking in obedience. And we were really struggling. Yeah. But now to be on the other side of that, man, I just want to encourage people, just take that step of obedience. Trust us. Go talk to that financial advisor. Do whatever you can, because God's going to do something in your heart and in your life. And maybe you won't get to a place where we are now, but you'll still get to a place where God's really going to do something in your heart and give you that opportunity to be like, man, I'm going to have open hands with all of my resources because they belong to God, and he does way more than I will ever do with it.
Yeah. I've got a ton of stories similar to those in my adult life. I remember the one that always sticks out to me is the first time God ever really like showed up in that situation and kind of in that big miraculous way. I would call it a miracle in a lot of ways. It's funny because it's so practical, and to a lot of the people involved in my story, to them is probably no biggie, right? And they may not think about it as much as I do. I remember I started tithing when I was working at Winn-Dixie, when I was a 17-year-old high school student, and I was on the worship team at my church. And the worship pastor, she really encouraged us, to follow this principle. So I started taking this $7 an hour paycheck that I got every week, from working at first it was McDonald's, and then I transitioned to Winn-Dixie, which is a grocery store in the South, by the way. If you've ever seen the movie Because of Winn-Dixie with the dog, it's a real place, a real grocery store. So I worked as a cashier at Winn-Dixie. So anyway, I tithe. So when it came time for me to actually leave for ministry school, people in my church just really showered me with generosity. I sent out support letters, and Michael, I think you did something similar when you left for ministry school, what we call Master's Commission. That's a different podcast. But I sent out these support letters, and people were just surprising me left and right with just the most generous ways possible. I remember one guy, he gave me this large amount of cash to I was well paid. My schooling was paid. I wasn't going to have to struggle for anything. He gave me this big wad of cash, and he says, "Do you have gas in your truck to even get to school?" Because it was 7 hours away in North Carolina. Yeah. I was like, "I'm going to go get gas later. I've got plenty of money to get it." And I remember getting to the gas station. He just fills up the tank. That guy later did that again one time at a gas station. He said, "If you pull the nozzle out of your truck before it's full, I'm going to break your legs." Which is, I always think about that, because it's it's people like that just go out of their way because God changed something in their heart to go out of their way to be generous with me. And that was the very first time that he proved his faithfulness, because I could not have done that alone. Yeah. And do I feel like that it has something to do with the fact that I was obedient even with that little paycheck I was getting from the grocery store? I do. I do believe that God was honoring something like that. So
these are such awesome stories. As I was thinking and listening to you guys talk, thinking through my life, first of all, generosity was modeled from my parents. And my parents, they were always at the church serving. They were always a part of what was going on there. I'd watch my dad mow yards for people at the church. I watched him do all these different things. Even to this day, Cassie just sent me a screenshot off of Facebook, and there was this golf outing that my dad plays in, and there's an organization called Cross-Eyes Missions that I actually got to go on trips with them, but they do eyeglasses for other countries. Oh, okay. So he's an eye doctor. So he has a golf outing every year, and Cassie sent me the screenshot from the golf outing where it listed a thank you to all the sponsors, and there's this company, and you get into the middle of this list, and there is Greg and Diane Reed, and that's my mom and dad's, mom and dad. Yeah. And so all these whole sponsors are companies who probably have money set aside for doing this, and they're my mom and dad, and awesome. She just sent me that text, and she's like, "I love that your parents are so generous," and so I have been raised in an environment where the generosity was just the way that you live. And so my story is more about the better to give than to receive. I've had all those experiences that you guys have had where God has come through in that way. But one of the most profound moments of my life and watching God work and how God is faithful. I was in college, and I was doing snow removal for a year, or for a winter, for the grounds crew. And I was using that money. I was paying off Cassie's engagement ring. I was doing a bunch of different things with the money, but it was my third job. And so it was just it was nice because it was extra income for after the bills that I was paying and whatnot. And I felt like God said, "Hey, there's this guy that you work with at your other job. He wants to go to Africa with the school." He wasn't a student. He was just a really cool guy. I loved him. His name was Jermaine, and I loved Jermaine. He was such a good guy. And so he was like, "I want to go do that." But Jermaine worked at a school cafeteria, so his extra income was not there. So I felt like God was like, "Hey, fund this guy's trip to Africa." And I'm like, "Okay." I'm like, "How do I do that?" He's like, "I want you to give all your snow removal money to that cause." I said, "Okay." Oddly enough, it started out a slow winter. January is, I think, warm, and I'm like, "Okay." We said we were going to do this, but I'm working 5-6 hours a week, and so I was still doing it, giving what I could, and then all of a sudden February hit, and we had, out of the 28 days of snow, or 28 days of February, 18 days had snow on the ground where I had to get up and go shovel snow, which is terrible as a college student because you get called at like 4 a.m. like to go shovel snow, remove snow. But like thinking back on that and thinking like God provided this kid's trip, he showed he showed this young man how he had thought about him, how he loved him, and I got to be a part of that.
Yeah.
Like, and this is like one of those ways in which generosity and giving, it blesses you. It's what Jesus says. It's better to give than to receive. Like I still think about Jermaine often. I think about that story. I think about that season. And when I do, I just remember how faithful God is and how faithful he is to allow us to be a part of the amazing things that he's doing in this world, and being a part of the way that he's advancing the kingdom.
Right.
And so that's kind of my story. And I got 1,000 other ones. I'm sure you guys do too. So, but I think we're wrapping up on time here. Any other thoughts, any other things that you guys wanted to highlight before we jump off?
As you were talking, I just had one thought of like, keep in mind as well that like generosity doesn't always have to look financial as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Your time, your resources,
Yeah.
like, I thought about this as you said, your parents are so generous. So you had that. My parents growing up, we had an open door policy to anybody. It felt like as long as it was safe, like as long as it wasn't like a dangerous person, people would come and eat. They had multiple people stay with them who were displaced. Where my wife and I, in this house that we have housed 3 different people who've gotten to stay with us who needed a place to stay, you know? We were just joking last night. We were cleaning up our garage. Like, I think we were going to take a break from it. It's nice to have like our garage back and our basement back. But it's being open handed with whatever you have.
Yeah.
If you're like, I don't
Right.
have liquid income.
100%.
Like if you're looking at tithing, like there's literally nothing left. Have it in your heart of how can I be generous with whatever resources I have, whether it just be something that Mackie said recently, your availability is your best ministry or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Your availability to people, to minister, to love on them,
Right.
to have a conversation, to have someone into your house to eat food, whatever the case might be. I've never regretted generosity.
Right.
Yeah.
Ever. I'm
Right.
sure you guys can say the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
Well, thank you guys so much for your insight today and for this conversation. If you at home are listening and you're finding these conversations beneficial, we would love it if you take the time to like, share. That way other people can benefit from it as well. But otherwise, what I'd leave you with today and what I want to challenge you with is if you are already tithing, what I'd encourage you to do is ask God what Pastor Michael just said. How can I live a generous life? What can I do today to be generous with someone with what I have? Whether you have 0 or whether you have $1 million, you know what I'm saying? And then if you're not tithing, what my encouragement to you is take those steps of faith. Begin with that level of obedience, and then see if God does not come through for you in the ways that you need Him, and because it will impinge on some of your wants and desires. It will impinge on even some of the more dramatic things at times, but God has always proven faithful, and He promises always to come through. And so that is my encouragement to you today as we sign off. We love you guys. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us next week.